New data out Wednesday shows U.S. inflation accelerated faster than economists had predicted in January. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, rose 0.5% for the month. It's also up by 3% since last January.
Acknowledged that prices will rise, at least in the short term. Now, that could turn into a headache for Trump after inflation rose unexpectedly last month, and for the Federal Reserve as it navigates the tricky path forward for interest rates.
Why is life getting more expensive? And what can you do about it? Many people struggle to keep up with prices rising on everything from rent to groceries. Is your paycheck growing fast enough, or are you falling behind? Cities like New York and San Francisco are known for their high costs, but even smaller towns aren't as affordable as they used to be. Living in the USA is exciting, but managing daily expenses has become challenging. So how do people make it work? If you want to live in the USA without going broke, here's what you need to know. The United States is a popular destination for students due to its reputable schools, diverse campus life, and job opportunities after graduation. However, studying in the USA is expensive, especially for international students who often pay higher tuition fees. In addition to tuition, living costs typically range from $12,000 to $20,000 annually, averaging between $1,200 and $1,700 per month. This includes expenses like rent, food, transportation, books, healthcare, and other daily necessities. Rent prices vary significantly depending on the city, with major metropolitan areas like New York and San Francisco being much more expensive than smaller towns. A big advantage is that cooking meals at home is generally less expensive than eating out, so students can save some money. Transportation expenses also vary by students' mode of transportation, whether they take public transit, own a car, or use ride-sharing services. By understanding these costs and developing a budget, students can manage their funds more effectively and reduce their financial stress to concentrate on their studies and personal development. As time went on, the need for accurate data became apparent. It wasn't until 1921 that the U.S. government published the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which measures how much it costs to live in major cities and tracks how prices change yearly. A story of change over time. Americans have been discussing the cost of living for a long time, even in colonial days. But figuring out exactly how much things cost and how those costs change over time has always been tricky. It wasn't until 1921 that the U.S. government officially published the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which became one of the most critical tools for understanding economic changes. The CPI measures how much it costs to live in major cities and tracks how prices change yearly. It provides valuable insights into inflation and how it affects people's ability to afford necessities like food, housing, and transportation. The CPI is still widely used today to monitor the economy and make necessary adjustments. Over the years, it has shown that very few things have remained as affordable as they once were. Essential prices have risen, making it harder for many families to keep pace. The CPI is also crucial in determining how much workers are paid, how much Social Security retirees receive, and how much income tax brackets go up so that people's income keeps up as prices rise. However, measuring the cost of living predates even the CPI. Congress chartered the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, in 1884, which began tracking American spending on daily goods and services. In the late 1880s, the BLS tracked the yearly spending of 8,544 families and logged the prices of 215 ordinary items. With time, the agency started using new techniques and broadened its efforts to provide accurate and comprehensive data. This information proved particularly useful in workers' negotiations with employers. Labor unions used the information to fight for fair wages, establishing that what employees took home kept up with increasing living costs. Without these measures, many workers would have difficulty showing that their pay was too little to support themselves and their families. The CPI and other measures of cost of living have a huge role in American life today. They guide policymakers, businesses, and ordinary citizens as the economy evolves so that they can make resets and adjustments to enable individuals to maintain their standard of living. Whether it's influencing salary increases, Social Security benefits, or tax policies, the CPI remains a key tool in nationalizing financial decisions. Over the decades, the CPI changed to match real-life situations. During World War II, new car and home appliance prices weren't counted since they weren't available, and more focus was placed on car repairs and public transportation. How the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, shapes our daily lives. Did you know that the prices of things you buy, like groceries, clothes, and rent, are tracked by the Consumer Price Index? It started during World War I, when the government wanted to pay shipyard workers relatively to prevent strikes. Soon, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, expanded this idea, collecting prices on everyday items from thousands of families. By 1919, the BLS started publishing these numbers, and by 1921, it looked more like the CPI we know today. Over time, the CPI changed to match real-life situations. During World War II, new car and home appliance prices weren't counted since they weren't available, and more focus was placed on car repairs and public transportation. In the 1950s, frozen foods and TVs were added, and by the 1960s, single-person households were included. In 1978, the BLS introduced the CPI for all urban consumers, or CPI-U, which better reflected the spending habits of most Americans. Later, in 2002, they created the Chained Consumer Price Index, or CCPIU, which adjusts for changes in buying habits. For example, if beef gets too expensive, people might buy chicken instead, and this version of CPI takes that into account. There's also an experimental consumer price index for the elderly, CPI-E, tracking costs for people over 62, especially their medical expenses. However, it's still considered experimental due to data limitations. Despite its importance, CPI isn't perfect. Some say it doesn't accurately reflect inflation for specific groups. If you spend more on gas and medical care, your inflation might be higher than someone who spends on furniture and clothes. Some argue that CPI exaggerates inflation, while others believe it underestimates it. Even with its flaws, CPI plays a significant role in daily life. It helps determine wage increases, Social Security benefits, and even how much tax you pay. Social Security payments, for example, go up based on the CPIW. The IRS also adjusts income tax brackets using the chained CPI, affecting how much tax people owe. For instance, the government tracks inflation using different methods. One of the most well-known ways is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Still, the Federal Reserve prefers the Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE, price index, which gives a more accurate picture of inflation. How inflation affects wages, prices, and everyday life. Have you ever wondered why food, gas, and clothes prices keep increasing? That's because of inflation, and the government tracks it using different methods. One of the most well-known ways is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Still, the Federal Reserve prefers the Personal Consumption Expenditures, or PCE, price index, which gives a more accurate picture of inflation. Social Security should use a special version of CPI called CPI-E, which focuses on the costs for older people. But studies show switching to this would only make a tiny difference, about 1/7 of 1% more per year. Now, let's talk about how prices and wages move. Over time, both usually rise, but not at the same pace. The CPI goes up smoothly, while household incomes rise and fall depending on the economy. From 2010 to 2024, prices nearly doubled, meaning $100 in 2010 had the same value as almost $187 in 2024. So, are Americans keeping up? Not really. While wages have increased, most benefits have gone to those earning higher salaries. Between September 2023 and September 2024, real hourly wages rose by 1.5%. But since people worked fewer hours, their actual weekly earnings only went up by 0.9%. One big issue is the minimum wage. Some states adjust it based on inflation, while others leave it to lawmakers. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 per hour since 2009. In March 2024, that amount was worth only about $10.50 due to inflation. A full-time minimum wage worker makes just over $15,000 annually, barely enough to survive. To keep up with inflation, that number should be around $21,870. The minimum wage was much higher in 1968, about $10.59 per hour today. If wages had increased with productivity over the last 5 decades, it would be over $22 an hour today. Instead, millions of workers are struggling to afford basic needs. On the other hand, families usually spend more. A 2-bedroom apartment costs around $1,500 in most places, but in cities like New York or San Francisco, that could jump to over $3,000. How much money do you need to live in the USA? Living in the USA can be expensive, but it depends on where and how you spend your money. If you live alone, rent costs about $1,300 a month. Utilities add around $220 monthly. Food is another significant expense. You'll probably spend about $450 on groceries. Getting around also costs money. If you take the bus or drive a car, expect to pay about $100 monthly. Other things like clothes, movies, or hobbies can add $160 to $250 to your budget. A family's grocery bill can be around $900 a month, and transportation costs depend on whether they own a car or use public transit. Healthcare is another significant expense, averaging about $12,000 per year. Similarly, sharing rent with roommates lowers housing costs, and cooking meals at home is much cheaper than eating out. How can students save money in the USA? Studying in the USA can be expensive, but there are many ways to save money and manage expenses wisely. Scholarships and grants can significantly reduce tuition and living costs, so it's essential to research and apply for as many as possible. Additionally, working part-time, especially on campus, provides extra income and helps students gain valuable work experience. Housing costs can be high, but sharing rent with roommates makes it more affordable. Cooking meals at home instead of eating out can save hundreds of dollars each month and promote healthier eating habits. Many stores, restaurants, and entertainment venues offer student discounts, so always ask before purchasing. Using public transportation instead of owning a car can also reduce expenses like gas, insurance, and maintenance. Keeping track of spending with a budget can help avoid unnecessary costs and ensure that money is used wisely. With careful planning and smart financial choices, students can enjoy their time in the USA without constantly worrying about money. Do the government's methods, like the Consumer Price Index or CPI, accurately reflect the rising costs for everyday people? Let me know in the comments below.